Welcome to the 3% podcast. This is a bonus episode in which we have the guest John Erik Riley, who is the managing editor at Cappelen Damm, in charge of doing all Norwegian fiction and poetry, joining me today for our month of Norway here at 3%. Thanks for coming on.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, we met not too long ago, like a couple months ago at the Lillehammer Book Festival on the panel that we did together. And I thought it would be great to have you come on and tell people a little bit more about Norwegian literature and about what's going on in that scene and like how things are going. Because I've been trying to write stuff about it for the website. And we are doing a lot of kind of research and information about Norwegian books, but it's still a little bit hard to like filter that through my lens versus someone who's actually in Norway and knows all of the authors and all of the different players.
And hopefully I'll get some perspective on what it's like to be in a little duck pond where I am. See myself from the outside, you know?
True. So one thing that will probably jump out to people is that you have a very American accent.
Yeah.
Because you are actually, because unlike most places where I think like we think of a Norwegian editor would be from Norway, but you're actually American as well, correct?
That's right. So my father and my mother met in the 60s. And my mother's from Norway. She was an exchange student in Maine and had returned to Maine to be in her host sister's wedding. Oh, and there she and my father hit it off. And one of the promises that my father made was that we would visit Norway. When they eventually got children, we'd visit Norway every other year until, the end of time. And he managed to keep that promise until the day he died. So we had a very strong connection to Norway. Wow. I also grew up speaking Norwegian in the household, although over time that became impractical because my father didn't know Norwegian particularly well. And we also had other friends. And that would be the end of the conversation with my mother. So Norwegian sort of devolved into being something you would use to discipline someone or give someone a secret message or whatever. But then I ended up going to Norway and living with my uncle for a year in the late 80s, and that led to an even stronger bond. And I should mention that I was also reading Norwegian books, at least when I was very young, and then I returned to that later, and there were Norwegian books in the household. Okay. So eventually I ended up in this situation where I'm like ping-ponging back and forth between Norway and the United States. I eventually meet my wife, Inger, and we decide to move to Norway permanently, and that's where I started studying comparative literature at the University of Oslo and ended up in the entire scene, you could say. There were two really big literary scenes back in the 90s, the one being in Oslo, the other one being in Bergen. Mm-hmm. Bergen's probably more familiar to the people who listen to your podcast because of my struggle, I would assume. Yeah,
for sure. But although, Oslo is the one city that everyone knows, too.
That's true.
Obviously. So what were the scenes like at that point in time?
There was this odd little, it's funny you should ask. He has a good sort of description of this. There was this odd rivalry going on where Bergen was sort of the underdog, it being a smaller city, but this is the age of big postmodern in theory, right? Right. And so Bergen was a little bit stronger with that, a little bit more avant-garde and radical. They had, and they still do have a really good writing program out there. So it was a slightly different scene where like the radical theory people would sort of merge with the creative writing scene. Okay. Whereas Oslo, being a bigger city, it was more like people coming in. And I would say that was more connected to the big newspapers. So, some of my earliest writing gigs were for Morgenbladet, which is sort of a intellectual weekly with news, and I don't really know what to compare it to in an American context. Yeah. And Klassekampen, which is like sort of the left wing newspaper. And so that's how I would describe it. Both of them ended up, fostering big writers in their own way.
Very interesting. How did you end up in publishing?
I ended up publishing because through my work in criticism, I ended up editing Vindue, which is a big literary journal. It's been there for decades.
Okay.
At Gyldendal, we were sort of a trinity of three different writers / critics. The one was a writer / filmmaker. And I did that for 4 years. And that sort of opened doors to all kinds of stuff. So after a while, I decided to move away from the literary scene just for fiction for grown-ups, and I worked in children's literature for 9 years.
Okay.
At Cappelen Damm, and during that, I had stints doing fiction translation, kind of what you do, and I also did a little bit of Norwegian fiction for a short while there, and then I gradually was moved into the place where I am now. So.
Interesting. So for people listening, like what are the main publishing houses in Norway?
Well, there are three giant ones that do all types of publishing. That would be where I work, Cappelen Damm, and there's Gyldendal, probably most famous for having the most Nobel Prizes of any Norwegian publisher.
Oh wow!
I think they have 50 now, if memory serves. I don't remember.
That's wild.
Yeah, they had a great editor who was very good at finding the big American, European writers way back in the day. And since then, they've built very strongly on that tradition. Right. And there's Aschehoug, which is sort of similar. Actually right across the street, there's a fountain between Aschehoug and Gyldendal.
Yep.
So it's like its own little publishing quarter. And then Aschehoug technically owns Oktobed, which is where Knausgård and Dag Solstad and a lot of the writers that are being translated now are published as well. Hanne Ørstavik, Love, I think that was pretty big in the United States, at least in critical circles. That was published there as well, I think.
Yeah.
I think maybe that was originally somewhere else. I don't remember. I think it was Oktobed. Yeah.
That makes sense. That's interesting. So so you're at one of the three biggest ones, obviously, and you're doing Norwegian fiction. What kind of trends have you been seeing or authors what's going on in the scene right now in Norwegian writing? Is everything, I think the perception here would be everything's just Knausgård, but another version.
It's interesting that you would say that, because there has been a pretty big debate of what they call it, virkelighetslitteratur, reality literature. It's not a very good term, but I think it popped up because the memoir genre, the term memoir, is not very strong in sort of the fiction, nonfiction world. Okay. So you had to kind of invent this other term. And so a lot of critics use that term to describe what has happened after Knausgård. But I would still say that what he did was so unique and so strange and so different that it's more that people are reading things with the lens of Knausgård than the fact that I wouldn't say that literature has necessarily changed that much. I'm the publisher of Vigdis Hjorth, and there was a large debate about her novel being autobiographical in an unethical way, I guess would be the
Is that Will and Testament?
That's the one, yeah.
Interesting.
Have you read that?
I read the first 60 pages of it when I was on this little retreat, and I was enjoying it quite a bit, and then I got sidetracked by reading this Shirley Jackson book, and it's a whole rabbit hole that I've gone down with too many people and written too many times now that I don't necessarily need to recount this, but I put it aside because I wanted to read The Sundial and loved it, but I want to go back and finish that book. So I read the first chunk, and I really like the sections where she's meeting with the wild character that seems a little bit unhinged and is having the affair and all that kind of stuff. But then all the stuff about the family, and the basic setup from what I got is that there is a family that has a couple cabins, and they are going to give them to 2 of their 4 children and not to the other 2, and this causes a huge family controversy. So that was a controversial book in Norway.
It was. The interesting thing is that it seems that there are a lot of takes of that book. I'm not going to go into the whole debate because it's a gigantic, convoluted Norwegian internal family dispute. But the most important thing, I think, is that more and more books are being read as autobiography when they don't necessarily present themselves as autobiography. They'll have. I mean, most books have, even the craziest, most abstract ones have some sort of autobiographical element, as we know. But I think the Knausgård it came in as such a huge, juggernaut, and sort of like divided the whole like perspective on, or defined, I guess, the perspective on literature.
That makes sense.
What I've seen recently, which I don't know if it's a trend or if it's a reaction or maybe just, the kind of thing that happens every once in a while, but I've seen a lot of like really interesting sort of speculative sci-fi fiction, or people are like trying to combine high literary fiction with science fiction in the way that it sort of reminds me of like Philip K. Dick or some Eastern European stuff.
Really?
And Boris Standvik would be one. I'm not really sure if that's more a response to just the place that we live in and the way technology, inserts itself into our lives and defines our lives.
Yeah.
But there's definitely it frees you from the whole, describing the contents of your refrigerator for 15 pages.
Right. So that's interesting. So coincidentally, there was the last time I was doing a 2-month review episode of the podcast, I talked to Rachel Cardasco, who is writing a book on speculative fiction in translation. And she said the hardest part that she was having on it was finding recommendations from like Norway and the Scandinavian countries overall, that she had no name. So like who else? So there is some sort of trend going on.
I'm the editor of one of the biggest ones here. His name is Tor Åge Bringsvärd. He's an absolute genius.
You're going to have to write these names out for me at some point too.
Yeah, I'll send you an email.
Cool.
And then all the weird Norwegian letters will turn to like parentheses and odd little characters just to make it even easier for you.
Good. Perfect.
Well, he's been doing this since the 60s. Okay. He is a science fiction writer. He's a children's book writer. I don't in my mind remember how many books he's read, but it's at least written. It's at least 100.
Wow.
And his children's books can be everything from extremely, full of fantasy and odd and strange to like very simple, realistic depictions of what it's like to be in a daycare center. When it comes to his fiction, he does all kinds of stuff. He's done science fiction. He's made this huge sort of like fantasy historical series called Gobi, as in the desert. I know he's been translated here and there.
Interesting.
He's just wonderful to work with as well. He's smarter and more fun than most people I know. We're doing a version of his, we're republishing one of his books this fall. And in that book, there's this guy who goes up to the top of a building and throws these manifestos. He folds them into paper airplanes and throws them off this building in London, I think it is. So we're making a cover that you can fold into a paper airplane.
Oh, wow. Nice.
And when I mentioned this to him, he was just like, I love it. Like he's very enthusiastic about things like that. But the interesting thing about him is that he has sort of done his own thing for decades. He was a friend of Kurt Vonnegut, so he used to like go out on the town together.
Wow.
One of his stories was in an anthology edited by Borges. Was my understanding. He'll tell these things like drop out of him during lunch. I'm like, what did you just say? He has a book by Vonnegut. See if I can remember the inscription. It was, "To my younger brother in the family of serious clowns." Sincerely, Kurt Vonnegut.
That's fantastic. Yeah, he sounds really interesting.
Well, now that we've mentioned him, it'd be interesting because you asked about trends, and there's certainly trends in criticism in Norway. Like, certain things will become more important, other things will sort of be pushed to the wayside, or into the gutter. When it comes to Bringsvärd, he's always had a very kind and encouraging sort of critical following. On the other hand, he's never become sort of like the central writer that other people follow or try to imitate. So he's sort of the exact opposite of Knausgård. So when you talk about trends, in a sense, like if I say that, like I said before, that there's some sci-fi speculative things going on all of a sudden that you didn't quite see as much of maybe 10 years ago, that's true and it's not true. This guy's been around all along, right? Yeah. And Knausgård, similarly, he did this sort of like memoir, this mishmash of memoir and novel writing and theory and essay. And there have been things like that before. I mean, he's a genius, so it kind of doesn't count. But in the sense that he's going to be a trend regardless of what he does. But the there's a very strong there's a lot of really good funding for Norwegian fiction and poetry, so a lot of people have been able to kind of noodle along with what they want to do regardless of what happens to be popular.
Right. So there's that's my sense too, and like one of the big differences between a country like Norway and America is that the marketplace exists, but there's also the support for authors and for creative endeavors that makes it a little bit less marketplace driven.
That's right. So when we publish a novel, it'll be a certain amount of a certain number of copies will end up in Norwegian libraries, and then a certain number will, and then a certain amount of funding goes to ebooks.
Right. Okay.
The same goes for poetry. You can sometimes you won't like they'll refuse to buy the book, and then you as a publisher have to pay the money back. But the process for fiction, at least in poetry, is that the fact that it's good enough is taken as given for most publishers, and then sometimes you'll get the bad news.
Right. That's a really great program, though. I remember when I was there, they explained a few different of the funding schemes. I remember that one, the purchasing program, but then there were some other variations too that the government was involved in. Did they do something? Does the government do something for bookstores as well?
Well, we might be thinking of is the fact that you have a fixed price model into a certain date. So when and that doesn't mean that the price of a novel is the same across publishing houses. What it means is that when you set the price of your novel, that price will remain in place until the free price period, it's called. So if I publish, I publish a novel today, and I'm like, well, this one costs so much, and I do the numbers, like, okay, that's going to cost 349 kroner. Some of the bookstores, or the bookstores and the book clubs they have a certain amount of percentage that they can reduce the price within. But aside from that, they have to stick to that. Okay.
Yep.
So then that will stay in place until the following spring, and then you can sell it at whatever price you want. Right.
Right. Which would be great. I mean, this is the sort of thing that I feel like in America, rather than trying to lobby against Amazon in like the way that, and by using like moral arguments and various other things to get people to buy independent bookstores, something like the fixed price model would make a much bigger difference.
You're probably right, but it's a very, very hard sell.
Yes.
That's the thing. I mean, I've been in this country now for a week and a half, and I'm realizing how much sort of the free capitalism mentality feeds into absolutely everything. Not to mention the healthcare system, where like there are ads, billboards about how you can fix your erectile dysfunction or whatever it happens to be. I mean, when you're living in Norway, it's just like, whoa, why is that in my face right now? With all respect to people who need medicine for whatever, I mean, I'm not making fun of that. It's just the fact it's like all in your face all the time. And there's always some sort of like, it's the same thing goes for insurance plans and so forth.
Yeah. There's no advertising for insurance plans. Like half of TV wouldn't exist.
Yeah, right.
It's crazy. It is. That's such a huge difference.
However, there's some downsides to this whole thing because sometimes a book would be selling really well, and you kind of wish that you could go down a little bit more to reach people. But all in all, I think it's a good model, and it works really well.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And it makes sure that a certain like writing culture, reading culture is in place. Right. And other countries who have done this are also happy with that model. I know. So
has there been any changes like in like readership for Norwegian books? Is it like going up, down, neutral? People.
The last statistics I read were that it's relatively constant. I don't remember the numbers in my head. I know that it's very high. What has changed is the same thing that you probably see in the United States is, we're kind of, with publishing, just like with everything that is connected to entertainment or culture, there are only so many hours in a day, right? And now what you and I are doing right now, a podcast, that is growing in Norway just like everywhere else. And so when are you going to read books? And you're also competing with like the Marvel Cinematic Universe and TV shows and video games. I work with reading, I work with writing. This is pretty much what I do all the time. Mm-hmm. And still I have to find my, if I'm going to play a video game, it has to be like the one video game I play that year. Yeah. I have to limit the other things to be able to pull that off, right? So, and I'm sure other people are doing the same thing, but from another scale. So you're seeing that books are statistics for book sales are going slightly down. it's still very strong compared to a lot of other countries. So I'm not going to like pretend that we're in some sort of like doomsday scenario.
Right.
And the price, the willingness to pay the fixed price beforehand is a little bit lower, unless it's like Vigdis Hjorth, Knausgård, Peter these big writers.
Which other authors, which other Norwegian authors should listeners of this pay attention to? Either that have been translated or should be translated.
Well, when we were in Lillehammer, I mentioned Eivind Hofstad Evjemo, whom I know hasn't been translated into English. I'm his editor now, and he writes these he can do just about anything, but he's written poetry that is I wouldn't call it abstract, but it's very it's not very like realistic in its form, I guess.
Right.
His novels are heavily political, but not in the way that they have some sort of he doesn't have a I'm going to say this in this novel the way I think you've read some of the old Soviet stuff.
Yeah.
That where even in Platonov you can tell that okay, somebody was deciding what he's allowed to say and not say.
Yeah.
So it's not that sort of thing, but it's fiction about the collective, like town, a certain group of people, usually somewhat. You see the town from one perspective and then from another perspective, and he has this incredible sense of empathy for everyone he writes about, regardless of where they are, politically, mentally, or whatever.
That's what we could use nowadays.
Yeah, definitely. It's that kind of. I don't really know who what I would compare it to in the United States. If I would say a less cacophonous Robert Altman, like with fewer characters. That's kind of that's a very hard sell. It's a really bad pitch. Sorry. There's like 3 people who have seen Robert Altman movies and 2 people understand what I'm talking about. But I think that's the closest I get to some sort of perspective on what he does.
I like that.
It's very, very well written. He doesn't do a lot of like the technical he doesn't do a lot of like literary fireworks in his writing. There's not a lot of like, metaphors and so forth. It's just really, really great stuff.
That's really cool. So it's funny that you make that comparison, because one of the things I found online was an interview you did many, many years ago for HTML Giant, in which you were asked to like compare people that you had seen, Norwegian authors you had seen at a party, to their American equivalents.
Okay, I'm going to stop you right here. I remember nothing of this.
Okay, so I was going to say, I'm going to read you one of them, and you tell me maybe you could tell a little bit about who the author is, but then if you still agree with your own assessment, because these are.
Well, when was this? Was this done in conjunction? Was this when I published my big novel in 2011 or something?
It was from it's from 2010. It's from the issue of McSweeney's, where they had the section on Norwegian writing.
Yeah.
And so is it Undun Mortensen?
Yeah, he's a great, mostly poet. He's another thing altogether.
Yeah. Okay. So you do have his comparison here too. You say so you guys there was a party that you both went to, a corporate literary party in Oslo last week, and got alcohol for free. And then he asked you, could you?
I remember this now. Okay.
For Undun Mortensen, you compared him to Stephen Malcolmus plus Facebook plus Ramona Flowers.
That is absolutely perfect. It's exactly what he is.
I love that one. That was my favorite.
He has a lot. He's sort of like a Andy Warhol type poet. He's very conceptual in what he does. And very funny. Okay. So that was I was very good there. I did exactly what I needed to do.
Okay, so here's some others that people should maybe have heard of. I don't know if and most of them have been translated. So Erlend Loe, who's become famous now again because Mayor Pete really likes him and learned Norwegian to read more of his books. You compared Erlend Loe to Douglas Copeland plus Andy Warhol plus Dave Eggers.
Yeah, that's pretty good as well, actually.
Yeah.
I probably would have switched out like either Dave Eggers or Douglas Copeland there, and maybe added a more realistic writer, but that's a pretty good description as well.
I like Douglas Copeland a lot. I used to a lot, and I met him in Iceland and thought he was just wonderful.
Funny story. I wrote a piece for Morgenbladet about trying to find the house where Douglas Copeland wrote Generation X in Palm Springs.
Oh, really?
because there's so many, houses and so forth around, New York or wherever you go, London. They'll be like, here's where so and so rode, blah blah blah, right?
Yeah.
And I was like, this novel has sort of defined so many things. It's even defined at least a word you use for a demographic.
Yes.
It's not being read anymore. So I reread the novel and sort of traveled around the Palm Springs area, with a photographer, a friend of mine, looking for this house. I reached out to Douglas Cappelen, to his agent, never got an answer. So I finally ended up at the public library, and to go through like old phone books.
Yeah.
In the hope that he had something there, or that his name was there. And unfortunately, a lot of them were in storage. So I never actually found the house, but it was a real fun sort of like Fear and Loathing in Palm Springs type of piece.
That sounds great. What was it like rereading that book? I haven't read that since it came out.
I still think it's really good, actually.
Okay.
It's a little bit generationally whiny. I'm of the same sort of age group and demographic. He does a little too much of the we are this and other people are that or whatever. But what I found really intriguing is that a lot of the things he writes about, media fatigue, the need to sort of unplug, the need for another utopia, whether that be like driving into the desert and finding some object or finding some sort of way to redefine yourself. All of that is still relevant. And in many ways can apply to millennials as much as to Generation X. So I thought it was a surprisingly good and fun read.
Yeah, the one I remember liking the best was Life After God, the short story collection.
It's fantastic. I reread that one as well. It's again, in my opinion, he always like brings it a little too far into like this sort of sentimental space.
Yeah,
but I still love it.
Yeah,
Life After God. In Life After God, it's that sort of need for religion, which he never really follows up that much. But
interesting. So here's another one. Roy Jacobson, whose books are published by Grey Wolf, does a number of them, I believe. He equals Jonathan Franzen plus Jack London plus John Irving.
And that's also pretty good. I would have taken out John Irving and replaced that with something else now. But
yeah, he seems
in
like
fact,
something...
we have his new novel coming out this fall. Both he and Arden, I'm publishing them now.
Okay.
And in his new novel, I compared to Jack London at our first meeting, and I had all these comparisons. He was like, he was very happy about that comparison. So this one is actually approved by the author.
Nice. Is that the book about traveling into Siberia?
Yeah, that's the one. It has an intriguing story because he met someone who used to work at Cappelen Damm, and her relative was collected butterflies and all kinds of animals for various museums and researchers and professors in Germany, and she inherited all of his drawings, or she and her relatives inherited all of his drawings and his they're not diaries, they're more like memoirs where he's like writing down his memories. Mm-hmm. And so Roy Jacobson and his wife, they sort of amalgamated this and turned it into a novel with illustrations. So it's an interesting sort of mishmash of different stuff. It's great. I absolutely love it.
He talked about it a bit when I was over there, and it sounded really interesting.
It is. It's also interesting from a sheer sort of literary perspective. Like how do you use this material? Mm-hmm. And it also describes a time and an age when our present relationship to nature was just really developing. Like industrialization was reaching the far reaches of the world, right? This is like the late 1800s, early 1900s. And they just like go out and shoot a Siberian tiger, and that was that day. Like it's just like so crazy. And Jack London sort of describes the same sort of mentality. But what makes it truly great as a novel, I think, is from time to time, this person, it's all written from this person's perspective. So his views of the world are intact. His views of like the, like they'll meet some sort of, native population up there in Siberia. And it's not like he's not going to be a little bit mean to them. Right. Yeah. So all that's sort of intact, but you also have his perspective, because he was a human of his time. We also have his perspective on like, well, when we were doing that, when I think about it now, so and so, right? Yeah. And the same thing goes for his relationship to the animals that they're out there hunting, right? They're out there hunting and sort of preparing them and for transportation. And at one point, they've shot some Siberian tiger, him and his brother, I think it is, and they're walking back, and the melancholy that suddenly hits him is so heavy. Like, what are we doing out here? Like, what is this? What is this? What is this job that we have?
Man, do you know if that's going to be translated into English?
I certainly hope so. It's a pretty special and interesting piece of I guess, fiction and nonfiction.
Yeah.
And for whatever reason, going back to what you're saying about trans, that is Norwegian literature has always been pretty good at that sort of in between space. If you go back to the 1800s with Knut Hamsun and his use of the immediate surroundings in Oslo, or it's not like that doesn't exist elsewhere, but it almost seems like Norwegian authors often are more comfortable in that space.
That
sort
makes
of
sense.
moving back and forth between the two polar opposites.
Right.
It may also be a purely legal thing that, in the United States, you would be sued for mentioning somebody's name too many times. I don't know.
much more the case in the UK, I think. Yeah. Meaning it sued super easily.
Because I read that. What's that book? I Hate the Internet.
Yeah.
You know that book? Jarrett Kobek, isn't that his name?
I think that's right.
Yeah, I interviewed him in Stavanger, and the British version of his book has a bunch of like redactions.
Right, exactly.
That he chose to just leave intact with a little like sort of inside joke for the readers.
So fun. So, okay, so there are two more people on here. The one I don't know, is it Anna Fiska?
Oh, yeah, she's a illustrator, comic book writer, or who is a comic book author? Is that what you call it?
Yeah.
And children's books. She does children's books, comic books, and the occasional book for grown-up readers.
Okay, so you compared her to Charles M. Schultz plus Chris Ware plus Dr. Seuss.
I definitely made her way too sort of high, like way too brainy. She's much more playful.
Okay.
So the Dr. Seuss fits, but not the two other ones.
Okay, fair enough. But then the last one is someone that I've been reading recently too, is Stig Saderbakken.
Yeah, he's an old friend of mine.
Is he? Oh, right. He was. Yeah. Well, rest in peace. But so you compared him to Edgar Allan Poe, Anthony Hegarty, and William Vollmann.
Yeah, I think I put some inside jokes in there for him to laugh about, because he was a big Anthony and Johnson's fan.
Yeah.
So that's probably why I did that.
That makes sense.
Vollmann makes a certain amount of sense, but he's obviously more. He's also a friend of mine, by the way. William Vollmann. Well, you've read Stig Saderbakken, and that doesn't really match up.
Yeah. I wondered about that because I've read several of them, and they're a little bit different than that. But he was a really interesting figure, and like a number of his books are available here. Because Zelke translated like 5 of them, I believe.
That's a lot. I thought it was fewer than that. Okay.
I think there are 5 because I bought all of them, but there are. This is embarrassing, but there are 3 of them that are listed under the wrong last name. So if you try and find them like on a Google search, you'll have a hard time with it.
I remember you mentioned this in another podcast.
Yeah, they fucked up Saderbakken so badly. It's like stir bacon or something. It's like not even close.
Right.
So it's like it's hard to figure out where the books are, but they do exist. Those books are dark.
Really?
Those books are very dark.
Yeah, well, they are. I mean, I do feel that he had a sense of humor, especially in the one Through the Night. If you read that one,
that one I haven't read yet. That one I was like, oh, I think I need to take a break.
Oh, it's that bad. Okay, yeah. Well, in Through the Night, he has this. The plot of the book is not. We're not talking to like a Disney movie here.
No.
But he ends up in Eastern Europe, and he meets some guy who's trying to live only on alcoholic drinks in this bar, and the conversation between them is pretty funny about like how do you pull this off? And I gotta drink a beer for breakfast because that's more food. And they're like they have all these like technical takes on how to pull this off.
Oh yeah, that's super fun.
That's my favorite novel by him by far.
Really.
And that was also kind of his breakout novel. Unfortunately, that happened like, shortly before he decided to skip town.
Yeah. Maybe I'll go back and read that one now since I've taken a little break away. But That sounds pretty interesting. There's one other thing I really wanted to ask you, because this is bizarre. Well, I guess I have two questions, but I did run your Norwegian Wikipedia entry through Google Translate.
Okay.
Okay, so you are a Norwegian author, photographer, and publisher. Also, all fine so far. But then it says he is referred to as the central figure in the so-called Blindness Circle.
Blindness? Oh, I think I know what that is.
What does that even mean?
This is really goofy. There's this guy who wrote an article in Dagbladet. And I think we have to go back to like 03, 04 or something like that.
Okay.
I remember it because I read it here in this house. I was not even in the country. So I was in my parents' house. And it was about like me and three friends of mine being particularly influential in publishing and so forth. So we call it Blinddarnkretsen. Blinddarn is the short sort of nickname for the University of Oslo. So it's sort of like a whole group of friends. And he sort of set it up as sort of like an East Coast, West Coast thing. There's Oslo and there's Bergen. So, we're back to that thing I talked about before. Yeah. It was just a really goofy thing, and it keeps popping up. I'm actually surprised that it's still there in Wikipedia. I'm not sure how it ended up there.
It's just in like the Norwegian version, and like it said automatically Google Translate, and I was like, sure, let's see what this says. And
it really is so funny. I don't know. There's certain like articles or certain things that like just end up like, especially in this day and age with the internet, like it'll just like keep perpetuating itself. So that one I often get asked about when I'm interviewed on stage.
Oh, really? The Blindness Circle?
And that's like 15 years ago.
Oh my God. Yeah, it just keeps replicating.
Well, you just found out like why I probably get asked about it, because it's probably on Wikipedia. So
yeah,
there you go.
It's the second sentence.
I don't generally spend my time reading my own entry on Wikipedia. I have other things to do, but
I can't imagine. one. I don't think anyone should. I think that's healthier not to.
Yeah, probably.
There was one other author that I know you guys didn't publish his most recent book, but Johan Harstad is someone that kept coming up when I was over there, and I know that you guys know each other and you know his work, I'm sure. And I wondered what your impression of him was.
Well, here we're talking about close friends, so it's kind of hard to have any objective perspective.
That's fine.
But we love collaborating,
mm-hmm.
He and I. And it's so deep that like my last big novel, which was in 2011, he actually has references to that. He took a character from one of my collections of short stories and sort of inserted him into his sort of big novel, which came out like 3 or 4 years ago. Max Misha and the Tet Offensive, I think it's called in English.
Yep.
And he came and visited me in Fairfax, or in Marin, California, when I was living there, and ended up like moving one of the bars in Larkspur up to Fairfax and putting a character there. So there's all this stuff going on. When he does he's a graphic designer. So when he does covers for like say Motorcycle or Thomas Dybdahl, this author, he'll ask me for some photography and I'll throw him some things.
Very cool.
To me, he is. I talked about Tor Åge Bringsvard before. He's sort of like his own animal. Like he's doing his thing. Sort of regardless. After he did Max Misha, which was a solely realistic novel, he did this. I don't even know what to compare it to, but it's sort of like a Pale Fire by Nabokov meets Monty Python. It is just this crazy thing full of footnotes and photography and kind of a parody of old like detective novels. And he just wanted to have fun after like the long, difficult work of creating this gigantic 1,000-page monster.
Yeah. What is the name of that book?
Fashkinen. It's a play on words that won't even work, but it's sort of like the guy who catches you in the act.
Okay.
But also in the novel, it also means Fashkin would be peach, I guess, like the fruit.
Interesting. So
and it's just full of like really like bad jokes that are so bad that they become good, and really funny parodies, and it's sort of just a really fun and good read. And it's very different from the one he did before that. I've only edited one of his books. I've usually read every single thing before it comes out. But the one that I worked on was a book for young adults called Darla.
Okay.
Which is sort of like a sci-fi. He's very fond of like Alien, a lot of like 70s, 80s science fiction. So sort of like that combined with a Charlie and the Chocolate Factory story about kids entering a lottery to go to the moon for the first time. And once they get up there, it turns into, one of those, this is an old like sci-fi genre where like people like running down hallways.
Yeah.
You see it in Star Wars too. So they're running down hallways trying to escape the monsters, and it ended up being very dark, and as it turned out, very popular. Won a prize and everything.
Oh, that's fantastic.
Yeah.
So what about
but two of his, that one's been translated into English, as has
Buzz Aldrin, right?
Buzz Aldrin, yeah, exactly.
Yeah, which is a big deal right now.
I'm sorry?
Which is a big deal right now after the 50 years of the moon landing.
Yeah, of course. But he's at smaller houses, right?
That came out from 7 Stories, I believe.
Oh, okay.
So smaller, but not very small.
Not tiny.
But they did pitch us when we were there, the Max Misha and the Tet Offensive, but with a very half-assed sort of pitch of like, this would be a great book to do. It's also 1,000 pages long.
Good luck.
We've got 150 pages translated into English and like a full German version for you. And it's like, oh geez. Yeah. Like this is like, sounds right up my alley, and also like an insane idea.
Yeah. Well, I think it's absolutely fantastic. So when it does find its translator, I really hope, it does find a home in the United States. I know that it's done very well in Denmark and in Germany.
Yeah. I'm curious. I had my interns are reading the sample that they gave me, so we're not putting it fully aside by any means. But this the one that comes after that sounds funny and wild. It also sounds like maybe even a better way to reintroduce him.
Yeah, maybe that one's completely different. And I would say most of his novels are quite different. What I love about his work is that he's not uncomfortable with inserting like a vampire story into something or
right.
Using without it. The only book that's really a genre book or even close to a genre book would be the Darla book I mentioned before. That one, it's pretty heavily, anchored in science fiction.
Yeah.
But the other ones, he'll just Max Misha is almost solely realistic, I would say, in form. But he does a lot of playful stuff in there too. He has sort of this you remember Jonathan Safran Foer's 2 first books?
Yeah.
Yes, that sort of light touch here and there that I really love.
That's cool. I mean, his books always seem like they would do really well here. Like they would appeal to the sensibility seems to match with what people kind of want, but 1,000 pages is maybe what people don't want.
Well, if they're good pages,
Oh, I agree. I love the long books, but I think I feel sometimes on my own with that. With your own writing, do you write in Norwegian or English or both?
I write in Norwegian.
Okay.
I've been sort of reflecting on that while I'm here. Like, why don't I just sit down and write something in English? And I have done that from time to time. And some of my books contain passages in sort of like, I guess you could call them parodies of how Norwegians write English. But generally, it just, when I'm trying to sit down and write, that's what comes into my head. It may have something to do with just the fact that I'm living over there, and that's the language I have around me.
Yeah, and that's interesting though. That you would choose to do that. That's great. And how many books have you written so far?
I'm blanking. Hold on.
You gotta plug yourself.
I'm gonna go to that Wikipedia page.
I was just gonna say maybe I can find that Wikipedia page again. I think I closed it by accident.
I think it's 9. The funny thing about me is that I usually, because most of my life is, this is so funny that I have to look this up.
I think it seems perfect.
Yeah, there we go. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9.
9.
10, 11. But one of those was written with 2 friends from that Blindness that you talked about.
Yeah.
That was interestingly enough, since I'm speaking to you, that was a book about with interviews with American authors. So we interviewed like Don DeLillo and David Foster Wallace and Laurie Moore and so forth.
That's great.
And then some of these are chapbooks and so forth. But my last big, fictional thing was Heimdall, California, which came out in 2011. And last year I had a sort of, it's filed under nonfiction, but it's also quite playful. That was like a 600-page book about surveillance culture.
Oh, wow.
That includes the piece I mentioned about Douglas Coupland trying to find the house there.
Yeah.
And that whole piece is about unplugging and so forth. But it also has a big long portrait and interview with William Vollmann, because he was surveilled by the FBI for decades.
Oh, really? That makes sense.
He wrote about it for Harper's. It's a great article, the thing he wrote there. He allowed me to sort of go through all the material he has on how this happened and why, including his file, and then we discussed it together while we drove to Deep Springs, California, which is this crazy college with an isolationist principle that he went to as a young person.
Oh, wow.
I guess they do have email now, but you weren't allowed to have, you can maybe write a letter every once in a while. That was it.
Right.
And they have like a ranch and everything. It was absolutely amazing and kooky and bizarre and fun. And he's a great person to talk to, very interesting and intriguing.
Yeah.
Always taking like the third and fourth perspective on things. Like he'd be like, well, the FBI probably did this, and I can see that from these 9 perspectives or whatever. Why that's a good thing, but to me, and then he'll finally, and if you've read Rising Up and Rising Down, he does this a lot.
Yeah. He's great. I just checked out his the new book about climate change and energy.
Yeah, I've only read the first of those. Have you read that?
No, I just got it out from the library here on campus like last week. So I haven't started.
Right.
It's huge. But yeah, I'm really interested in both of those volumes.
Well, when I was traveling with him, I didn't write about this in the last book, but he was traveling with there's a dosimeter and there's another like radiation measure thing. And he had it with him. So he'd be like measuring sandwiches and noting, like writing down like the various values, because he was going to had used it and was going to use it again in Fukushima, because he likes to do research at the base level. So, you know, when he was did his whole thing about the Salton Sea and that whole area there, called Imperial, he would, eat the fish there. He would go there with, scientists and check the levels, do everything himself.
Yeah.
And he was doing the same thing then in Deep Springs, like measuring rocks and cactuses and so forth.
That's wild. I do want to, for the benefit of everyone listening too, so Heimdall, California has a Goodreads page that is willing to translate into English the description. So again, here go Google Translate. But this seems pretty solid. It sounds wonderful. The Norwegian American celebrity chef Balder Maham suddenly has a spectacular breakdown on live TV. The collapse causes him to partially lose his memory. While the debate about his cultural personality and food philosophy rages in the media, Balder closes himself in his apartment and tries to reconstruct his life out of the stumbling blocks of memories and a multitude of issues he finds about himself online. Who is really Balder Maham, and what has happened to him? The story that is uncovered is more dramatic and complex than one would think. Very fun, fervent, satirical, and genuine. Sounds really fun.
There's some good words.
This is great. This is good selling stuff. We get an insight into old terrorist movements, Battlestar Galactica, sexual escapades, photo excursions, downhill walks in the desert, pro-Ana slimming tips, and the rules of life for VHEMT, VHEMT.
Oh, that's one of the organizations of the book.
Okay, got it. That sounds really fun.
Yeah, I had a lot of fun writing that one. That was a wild ride. It has an interesting history too, because it came out and the first review it got was just slaughtered it, just tore it apart.
Oh God!
And then and that was in a big Norwegian newspaper. And then the second, that was Dagbladet. And then I think it was the day after that, like 2 days later, it got like this rave review, just absolutely like this is the novel you need to read this decade kind of thing.
Wow!
And because those 2 reviews came out in big newspapers, that became sort of the history of the book, and I guess it made people more intrigued than they would have been with just like rave reviews. I'm guessing. So that was good for the book. It was not fun to read that first review.
No, I can't imagine.
I don't generally read reviews, but they were like, "You're gonna have to read this because it's not very kind." And you're gonna be facing that when people ask you questions. So.
Oh, ouch! And it's 800 pages.
Yeah, 800 something. Yeah. It does include photography though. So.
Oh, okay.
In sheer mass of text, it's probably about 700 or 750.
That sounds perfect. I'm a sucker for these long books. I love them all. Is there anyone else, any other authors that maybe have been translated that you think listeners should check out?
That haven't, or
that they could read.
You're thinking about Norwegian authors.
Yeah.
Yeah, we published this author Gina Cornelia Pedersen,
Okay.
and I know she's come out in English. I don't remember which press that is, and I know it's a small press in the English speaking world, but her stuff is absolutely unique. She writes usually from the perspective from a younger person. And I guess in another world where people were more surrealistically capable in their minds, it would even be classified as YA in a sense, but it's absolutely bizarre and wild. She's really good at sort of anchoring. You know, some authors are really good at describing the perspective of what it's like to be young without sort of cheating. They can sort of, you know, I mean, when you're a kid, you like wake up, and if the tree was moving strangely outside, that wasn't a tree, that was actually a ghost, you know?
Yeah.
It wasn't like a tree pretending to be a ghost or a tree you think is a ghost. It is a ghost. She doesn't write, there's a lot of drug abuse in the one book. It's not necessarily like naive or kind fiction, but it's very real and it feels very visceral. So, and she's working on a trilogy now. We published her the first of many books about this one person last year to really good reviews again. She used to be with October, now she's with us.
Oh, very cool.
But it's hard to describe because I mean the storyline is usually pretty straightforward. There's, you know, you have your upbringing and then you move forward into young adulthood, or you know, you're a person delving in substance abuse, you're kind of going crazy or whatever it is.
Right.
But it's, as in all good fiction, it's the writing and the way that she pulls it off that makes it really intriguing and good.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. That sounds.
What about
perfect.
you? What should I read?
Oh God, that's a much harder question. Like, especially if I haven't read a lot of American authors recently. I have some, but they're usually like.
Well, give me an Eastern European one.
Eastern European one. Well, I'll give you. Why don't I give you one of the favorite books that I've been working on editing, and that is coming out next spring here. But the author is being translated in Norwegian as well, and you guys are publishing her. Is Sarah Mesa is a Spanish author, and we're doing 4x4 first, and then Cara de Pan, and you guys are doing Cara de Pan first, and then I'm not sure about 4x4, but I've been working on 4x4 for the past few weeks, and it is brilliant, and like it's got this. It's about like a boarding school in which like there's like this, you know, the highfalutin sort of headmaster and advisors, and it's this boarding school that's separated from the outside world because the outside world seems very scary and dangerous and potentially bad. There's a certain number of students there, 20, that are always there as scholarship students, whereas everyone else is like the rich elite. But the scholarship students are like in a position of like near powerlessness. And so as the three sections of this book unfold, you get to see this like really dark vision of like the stuff that happens on how people are abused, or like cycles of abuse and being taken advantage of. But it also has this really funny tone to it because there's just various humorous bits about like boarding school stuff where like people speak all pompously and then the kids are like undercutting that. And the language in it is very precise and like direct and fun. I really like that book. It's part of it is that I'm really deep into it at this moment. But since you guys are publishing her in Norwegian too, it's like a perfect match.
Yeah.
I would highly recommend her.
Sounds good. The last book I read was Mesha Selimovic.
I don't think
Do you know this?
No.
It's called The Fortress.
Oh, that doesn't ring a bell.
He was published during the 90s. You know Dubravka Grisic. You published her. So you remember how like in the 90s there was this whole like we have to translate fiction from the former Yugoslavia because war. Not because good, but because war. In this one, it's like sort of framed like these are the. I've read 2 books by him now, and it's sort of framed like these are the books you need to read to understand the terrible conflicts, et cetera, et cetera. But he's when you're sort of researching Balkan literature, Ivo Andrić will pop up a lot, and this guy's sort of like his more convoluted cousin. It's the same sort of worldview, but who's good and who's bad is always very murky.
Yeah,
It's got a more Kafka-esque aspect to it, I would say.
I have Death and the Dervish, the other book of his that that came out from that Writing from the Unbound Europe series, which are so iconically bland in their cover design.
Well, that's what I'm talking about, because the Death and the Dervish is the first one I read, and it has a whole like you have the same thing with Ivo Andrich. Like, we have to read these because we have to understand this war, instead of like we have to read this because we have to understand humanity. Death in Dervish I thought was absolutely fantastic. This one, The Fortress, I'm not so jazzed up about.
Oh, right.
But that may be the summertime lull.
Yeah, that's true. We've been doing the end of this, like they're not horror books, but like books that are psychologically unnerving. So we did a short story collection by a Korean author, Ha Song-nan, called Flowers of Mold, which is done very well for us, and it's very, very cool and like weirdly urban and disturbing. Things like that can just start things happen to characters that seem kind of out of nowhere, and then like the stories will just abruptly end, but they're always like a little unsettling and uncanny. But her new collection that we're doing, Bluebeard's First Wife, is very scary in a lot of ways. Like, it feels like the world is a dangerous place, and this one's more set in like remote areas. It's not all in like Seoul or in like that sort of that part of humanity, but people will be outside of the main city, and yet like all these weird things will happen to them, and it feels like there's just this level of like danger at play all the time, and it's been pretty wonderful to read. Actually, I'm finding myself really enjoying these more than I would have said beforehand. Like I would always been like, oh no, I don't read like horror things or things like that. But these aren't horror per se, but they have those psychological elements that are there and that make it very interesting and very unnerving.
Well, I don't know if you've seen Chernobyl, the series, but that's been interesting to watch because it does definitely use sort of horror tropes in it.
Yeah.
Do you know the series?
I do, but I haven't been able to watch it because I don't have anyone's HBO Go password yet.
Okay.
But when I
you have to steal that. It's definitely worth seeing, even though they take some liberties. What was the name of the author you mentioned? I'm sorry, what was that name?
Ha Song-nan. It's like SEONG-NAN. Yep. Yeah. Okay. She is great.
Because I picked up Han Kang on my way here, whom I haven't read. So I picked up the one. Is it called White in English?
Oh yeah, it's like the White Book, I think.
Yeah, well, it's just called So White Book. Yeah, the book. I think that's right. I have it lying around here. That's my next one. I'll probably finish that before I head back to Norway.
That one I haven't read. I read The Vegetarian. I have mixed feelings about it, but it's like but she's similar to this same thing that I'm describing too, where it's like things are sort of realistic, but there's also like there's like a level of danger outside of that's baked into sort of the interactions between human beings. And that's I like that a lot, where it's not like supernatural horror. It's like people are going to do bad things.
I'm intrigued by that because I've noticed, I've listened to your podcast a few times, or quite a bit actually, and it seems like that's one thing that American fiction isn't particularly good at, but that fiction from other parts of the world is better at, and that's that sort of feeling of something being unsettling without it necessarily being locked into some sort of cinematic realism, I think was the term you used.
Yeah.
It certainly exists over here, but the way that Eastern European writers do it, the way that some Asian writers do it, it feels more like our times. Just this feeling like there's some sort of thing rolling along, and we don't necessarily know we know the reason is climate change or populism or whatever, but
right.
There's this feeling of something being like incredibly threatening that we don't necessarily have control over.
That's true. That's interesting.
It'd be interesting to hear your perspective on that, because that's kind of the general sense I get, that American fiction is great at a lot of things, but not necessarily that one thing.
That's interesting. I haven't really thought of that, but the examples that jumped to mind, like I read over like Christmas, read The Changeling by Victor Laval. This one of those sort of like contemporary horror sort of books. And I liked it for quite a while. I thought it was pretty interesting. It was kind of creepy. It was weird. But then there's like a fucking troll, and it's just like became a book about a troll. I was like, this is stupid. And I was immediately disappointed. Whereas I like those ones, but there's sort of that trend now with movies of like the social, what do they call it, like social horror. Like Us and Get Out and things like that, where it's like the horror is there, but it's really more of a reflection of society's ills and horrors. I think that there's more people that are going to try and do work in that vein, and maybe that gets closer to what we're describing. But you're right; it's always
film has been. David Lynch is American.
Yeah.
His stuff is exactly like that.
Yep.
But a very good example would be like Death and the Penguin. Have you ever read that?
Yes.
Kirchhoff. Yeah. Suddenly there's a penguin. You got to take care of the penguin. It's not unsettling. It's more comical, but it's never really explained. I mean, you can read it as a metaphor for this or that. But, and these days it would be like the penguin is like that because he bit a radioactive penguin. And now he's a super penguin.
It's like always has to be an explanation.
Exactly.
We don't need that. We just need the images. That's why those David Lynch movies work so well, and why Twin Peaks works so well. Is it doesn't try and explain itself. It just is.
Yeah,
there.
It has some sort of internal logic, but it's more like a dream logic. You know?
Yeah. Everybody who's listening to this, I know you're already sick of it, but that's what really struck me about the Shirley Jackson books when I was reading them, is that they function sort of like the Lynch stuff, where weird things happen, they're not explained, they're just there as part of this kind of, and they make sense within the book, but at the same time when you get done you're like, what the fuck was that? Like how did that wait? Was that person even a real person? Like it's odd, and I like that feeling in books to capture. So hopefully there'll be more of it. But anyways, well, thank you very much for doing this. It's very fun to talk to you.
Thanks for having me. It's been fun.
Of course.
Great chat.
This is great. Cool. And if anyone wants to find you online, where should they go?
I think they'll just have to search for my name. I think that's the way to go. Okay. But Cappelen Damm, I'm sure I'm on their website.
Good. You're not a Twitter, Instagram user.
I am. In Norwegian, I'm monografi, MONOGRAFI, and then on Instagram, I'm Post Pacific.
Okay.
That's more of like a private photography, not private, but it's just like my photography.
Oh, very cool.
I just recently traveled in Bosnia to Srebrenica and so forth. I have some stuff about that there.
Wow. Okay, I'll link to both of those.
And then I'm Post Pacific on English-speaking Twitter, but I don't really use that very much anymore. That became sort of my Twitter. Speaking of which, it was July 22nd yesterday, which was the anniversary of the terrorist attack in Norway.
Oh, man.
So I sort of started using that to sort of express my perspectives and feelings in English. So Post Pacific was sort of a sleeping Twitter handle, and then all of a sudden I just started writing about different things connected to that. Like a lot of Norwegians, we just had to figure out what the heck is going on and what is this, and we didn't think this would happen here and so forth.
Yeah.
But since then, I mean, yesterday I posted a little thing, but it's like that one's been kind of hibernating for a number of years.
Yeah.
So Post Pacific on Instagram, or monografi in Norwegian, where I occasionally do the occasional English tweet.
Ah, very cool. Very cool. Well, I'll link to all those, and people can check it out and check out all the Norwegian books and be on the lookout for all the authors that you named to get translated into English. Or if you can read Norwegian or learn Norwegian.
Yeah, and thank you for your perspectives on things too. They're helped me out in trying to figure out what kind of duck pond I live in. So.
No problem, man. Thank you very much.
All right, take care.